Hello everyone, Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is 2019. For this episode, I thought that I would put together a sort of supplemental episode to the McMartin aspect. I found some information of a chronology of events from a website about famous trials, and I sort of just want to go through this. I've not actually read it. I don't know what it says yet, but I'm just going to give my off-the-cuff responses to it as we go through this. And there's also a letter from the police chief to the parents of the McMartin Pre-school children that I'm going to read to you to show how this thing sort of started to go massively sideways. If you haven't seen or heard my episode on the McMartin Trial yet, go back and check that out before you go to this one. Now, the first thing that you have to understand about this is that the people who run this website, whoever they are, over the Famous Trials website, have bought into the witch hunt narrative hook, line, and sinker. I mean, they just completely believe it. Satanic Panic myth, all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's just all throughout the assumptions of it. If you want to know more about that, check out Professor Ross Cheight's book called The Witch Hunt Narrative. It was published by Oxford University Press. He's a professor at Brown University. And he is a political leftist, and you know how critical I am of lefty professors. He actually does a fantastic job in this book, though. So this is called Chronology of the McMartin Preschool Abuse Trials. Starts off with a picture. It has digging for tunnels on the McMartin Preschool grounds. And I think this is one of the digs that was actually being performed in a wrong location, one that was never actually identified by any of the children as where the tunnels actually were. That was a big problem that they had for the first 3 digs that took place there. The 4th one was the only one that actually took what the children said seriously, and it was the one that ended up concluding that there was rather strong evidence that tunnels at one time had existed. So it begins here. May 12, 1983, Judy Johnson drops off her 2.5-year-old son, Billy, for his first day at the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. August 12, 1983, Judy Johnson calls the police to report that her son had been sexually molested at the McMartin Preschool by Ray Buckey, age 25. The charge is made after Johnson, earlier in the day, took her son to a doctor because his anus itched. Johnson reported to detectives that a spot of blood on the anus was discovered on her son after a day at school. Now, this section here is completely, totally, factually wrong and completely misleading in every way that I can think of. So, first of all, Judy Johnson had been noting that her son had been complaining of abdominal pains ever since he first started going to the school. He had repeatedly been found with blood coming from his rectum by his mother. She took him to not just one, but ultimately 4 different doctors who saw her son, and all 4 of the doctors believed that some form of sexual molestation had happened to this child. This thing is also wrong where it basically implies that Judy Johnson was the first person to ever contact police. That is actually not true. As you find out in Professor Cheight's book, the first person to contact police was a mandatory contactor, which was one of the physicians who suspected that sexual abuse had taken place. They actually made the first contact with police. This is part of why the witch hunt narrative or satanic panic mythos is so clever. It's one of the reasons why it is so effective is because it is so incredibly deceptive on so many different levels. Because what they try to do is they try to focus everything back to this one lady, Judy Johnson, and then later they try to say, oh, well, she was just crazy. She was crazy the entire time. She imagined everything, and then this whole thing just blew completely out of control. But actually, no one at the time ever thought that Judy Johnson was crazy or had psychiatric issues or anything like that. She actually had no record of psychiatric problems whatsoever. Even a member of the prosecution team who later left it, named Glenn Stevens, said that he had seen no early signs that she had psychiatric issues. It was only later, as the case expanded, and then she started to see that perhaps there were half a dozen or dozen or dozens upon dozens of children who had been abused like her son had been, that she started to sort of lose it. And you can imagine it really wouldn't be all that hard for a parent to go down a path like that once they start seeing things like that happen. August 18, 1983, Judy Johnson meets with Detective Hogue to press her complaint that her son had been sexually abused by Ray Buckey. August 30, 1983, Johnson takes her son Billy with her to the police station for an interview. Her son reports that he had been abused by Ray Buckey. September 7, 1983, Ray Buckey is arrested. And here is where a major problem for the case erupts. September 8, 1983, Police Chief Harry Kuhlmeyer sends a letter to 200 McMartin Preschool parents informing them that Ray Buckey is suspected of child abuse and asking them for further information. So let's take a look at the letter. I have it here. I'll read that, what he sent out to the parents. It begins, Dear parent, this department is conducting a criminal investigation involving child molestation. Ray Buckey, an employee of Virginia McMartin's preschool, was arrested September 7, 1983 by this department. The following procedure is obviously an unpleasant one, but to protect the rights of your children as well as the rights of the accused, this inquiry is necessary for a complete investigation. Records indicate that your child has been or is currently a student at the preschool. We are asking your assistance in this continuing investigation. Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim. Our investigation indicates that possible criminal acts include oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttock or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of, quote, taking the child's temperature. Any information from your child regarding having ever observed Ray Buckey to leave a classroom alone with a child during any nap period, or if they have ever observed Ray Buckey tie up a child, it is important. Please complete the enclosed information form and return it to this department in the enclosed stamped return envelope as soon as possible. We will contact you if circumstances dictate the same. We ask you to please keep this investigation strictly confidential because of the nature of the charges and the highly emotional effect it can have on our community. Please do not discuss this investigation with anyone outside your immediate family. Do not contact or discuss the investigation with Raymond Buckey, any member of the accused defendant's family, or employees connected with the McMartin Preschool. There is no evidence to indicate that the management of Virginia McMartin's preschool had any knowledge of the situation, and no detrimental information concerning the operation of the school has been discovered during this investigation. Also, no other employee in the school is under investigation for any criminal act. Your prompt attention to this matter and reply no later than September 16, 1983 will be appreciated. Chief of Police, so on and so forth. Now, this is just completely disastrous for him to have no idea why anybody would do something like this. This is an absolutely terrible decision. Terrible decision. September 30, 1983. Judy Johnson reports to police that Billy said that Ray Buckey sodomized him while his head was in the toilet. Reports get ever more bizarre. Johnson reports, for example, that Buckey wore a cape, wore a Santa Claus costume, dressed up like a minister, took Billy to a car wash and locked him in a trunk. Teachers at the McMartin Preschool are said to have chopped up rabbits and to have placed some sort of star on Billy's bottom. Now, they've mixed up all kinds of things here with this particular sidewinder that they've dropped in. One of the things they don't mention is that a number of the children said that they had actually been drugged or indicated that they were giving some sort of substance that caused them to be sleepy. They said that it was a pink or red liquid. I find it very interesting that that wouldn't be mentioned here as a possibility for how these sorts of things could be maybe dreamed up or imagined by the kids, you know. Who knows what sort of altered state of mind they would have been in had they been drugged. And we do know that child molesters, that all kinds of rapists do engage in this sort of behavior. We've seen this with Bill Cosby. We've seen it with Jimmy Savile. We've seen it with Jeffrey Epstein. All you have to do is look into those cases and see that that is something that is commonly done. The aspect here where it talks about, quote, chopped up rabbits, that is actually about how they threatened the children to maintain their silence. They would use small animals, and then they would kill the animals in front of them. According to the children, they killed turtles and rabbits and other small children. They would say, this is what's going to happen to you if you tell your parents or anyone else about what's going on here, so on and so forth. And actually, in some of the archaeological digs that were done looking for the tunnels, they did turn up all kinds of small animal bones. Some people say that this supports the children's claims. Other people say, well, the bones could have been there from all kinds of other causes. October 17, 1983, the District Attorney's Office asked Key McFarland, a consultant for Children's Institute International, CII, to interview supposed child sex abuse victims. Now, the important thing to remember here is that Key McFarland and the people at CII were not doing this with an eye towards prosecution of a case. They were doing this in a therapeutic manner, in a therapeutic setting, trying to ascertain what actually happened with the children. November 1983, CII begins interviews, and they begin diagnosing former students of the McMartin Preschool as having been sexually abused. By March of 1984, the count of those diagnosed as sexually abused reaches 360 students. Now, for more information on the problems with this, it's simply too large for me to actually go into here. I will link the book below, Professor Chait's books. You can get that and check that out and find out how many problems there are with just this one small section. January 13, 1984, Virginia McMartin and Peggy Bucky permanently closed the McMartin Preschool after 28 years in business. February 3, 1984, KABC reporter Wayne Satz startles television viewers with reports of a massive child abuse scandal at the McMartin Preschool. It's important to note here this took place during a sweeps period, so it did pull in huge numbers. And also it is suspected that Satz had gotten his information from people at CII, probably people who were very disturbed about the things they were starting to hear from the children. And then this caused the case to absolutely explode. Now, a perfect contrast for this is actually to look into the way that Janet Reno handled the Country Walk case, or Frank Fuster case, down in Florida. You can go and listen to my episode on that. She ran a very tightly controlled case there and was able to end up securing a conviction at the end. If this case had been ran the right way in terms of the investigative process and the prosecutorial process, they very much could have ended this whole thing with a conviction. February 24, 1984. The Currys, McMartin parents, sue Virginia McMartin, Peggy Bucky, and Ray Bucky for assault and battery and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They ask for $1 million in punitive damages. March 11, 1984. A number of daycare centers in the Los Angeles area are raided and searched, but no incriminating evidence surfaces. Now, this is a mixture of truth and untruth. It's untruth are the unstated portions, that there were actually a whole lot of other suspects in that area. The suspect list increased to about 40 at one time. Some of the people involved in the suspect list, because the children were identifying people from the local area who had been basically exchanging children from one center to the other center for these abuse practices. One of them was called the Wolfman. And this fellow actually is mentioned in an LA Times article that I have here that I'll read part of it for you. November 14, 1985. Uncharged McMartin case suspect found dead. An uncharged suspect in the McMartin preschool molestation case has been found dead in his Long Beach apartment, authorities said Wednesday, but the cause of death has not yet been determined. Foul play is not suspected. Robert Hamill Winkler, 35, was free on bail while awaiting trial on unrelated child sexual abuse charges involving a Torrance babysitting service. He died in the early morning hours of November the 6th. His death was not disclosed until Tuesday, when he failed to appear in court with co-defendants Timothy Paul Ricketts, 19, of Lomita, and Angela Darnell, 22, of Torrance. Now, eventually, I think they determined that this was a drug overdose. Continuing the article, the bearded, long-haired Winkler had been identified in photographs by several former McMartin pupils as one of the, quote, ubiquitous strangers who figure in the case, according to Deputy District Attorney Lel Rubin. A subsequent raid on the Lomita home of Winkler's girlfriend last February yielded a pair of rabbit ears, a black cape and cloak, and black candles, a find that prosecutors characterized as, quote, tremendously corroborative of some preschoolers' accounts of having been molested and frightened into silence by seeing rabbit's ears cut off and witnessing satanic rituals. He, Ricketts, and Darnell had been ordered to stand trial on 20 felony counts of molestation involving 6 children left in their care at the Cocoa Palms Motel Apartments in Torrance, California. A new trial date for the 2 other defendants has not yet been set. I would say that's fairly important and relevant information, would you not, vis-a-vis the chronology we're covering here? Interesting how it isn't mentioned at all. March 22, 1984. Ray Bucky, Peggy Bucky, Virginia McMartin, Peggy Ann Bucky, Ray's sister, Mary Ann Jackson, Betty Rader, and Babette Spittler are indicted on 115 counts of child sexual abuse. Now, this is the grand jury that I mentioned before in the McMartin episode that you need to listen to if you haven't so far, that basically went hog wild and got out of control even beyond the prosecutors because they were indicting people that they did not actually even want indicted. April 2nd, 1984, the LA Times reports that students at McMartin have been fondled, raped, photographed nude, and forced to witness animals being slaughtered. Now, this whole part about being photographed nude was related to a number of the children who were saying that they played, quote, what was called the naked movie star game. Interesting again how they don't point that out. April 12, 1984, the Children's Institute launches a campaign for public donations to help with its investigation of the McMartin case and other supposed cases of daycare abuse. By 1989, it will have received over $11 million in government grants. May 1984, the indictment count reaches 208, involving 40 alleged child victims. June 1984, bail for Peggy Bucky is set at $1 million. Ray Bucky is held without bail. January 12, 1984, a federal grand jury is impaneled to begin its own investigation of the case. July 1984, 30 additional individuals are placed under investigation. August 8, 1984, Prosecutor Lael Rubin announces that the 7 McMartin teachers committed 397 sexual crimes in addition to the 115 for which they already faced charges. December 1984, the ABC show 2020 runs a segment on the McMartin case, largely adopting the prosecution's view of the evidence. March 1985, a group of nearly 50 McMartin preschool parents, led by Bob Curry, arrive at a lot next to the school and begin digging for, quote, the secret underground rooms they believe where the scene of massive sexual abuse of children took place. A few days later, an archaeological firm hired by the district attorney's office begins its own dig. And then they put here in a parenthetical, no evidence of the secret rooms is ever found. Of course, that means that you have to leave out the dig that was done in 1990, but could not be admitted to trial. And I will link that below. That would be Dr. Stickles' dig. And there is a private investigator with a radio show named Ed Opperman. He actually interviewed a geologist that was a member of that team, and he said that he's been completely misquoted many times in the public. He believes, too, that the dig was professionally conducted and that they did find evidence of rooms, and I will try to find that and link that below for you as well. March 6, 1985, Judy Johnson is hospitalized following a psychotic episode. Now, of course, how they know it's a psychotic episode, I'm not real sure. I don't know how they have access to hospital information like that, but also I can tell you that it is highly unlikely that they actually had a psychologist or a psychiatrist on hand who diagnosed her with this. This is probably just some ER admitting physician who put that diagnosis down for her, if this reporting is even accurate. And again, the reason why they're doing this is because they are trying to say that, well, everything originates with her. She was just crazy. The whole thing should be ignored. And, basically, it's a weird way of attacking the victims. We're supposed to care about people with mental disorders, but then they say don't care about this person with a mental disorder because she's a troublemaker. But that is the power of the witch hunt narrative of the Satanic Panic mythos. September 1985, some members of the prosecution team begin to express doubts about the case. Now, what this is referring to very obliquely is Glenn Stevens, who ended up signing a rather lucrative book and film contract with the Manns. And this, the Manns refer to Abby Mann and his wife Myra, who co-wrote what ended up being the 1995 film with James Woods called Indictment, which basically follows the witch hunt narrative absolutely to a T, and that is the one that people totally believe. Now, they ignore the other movie that took more of the prosecution side of it, which was Do You Remember the Muffin Man? This came out, I believe it was in 1988 or 89. I'll link that below. You can actually watch the entire film on YouTube, and it's basically a complete contrast to what you see in the Indictment. And ultimately, no one really knows how much money Glenn Stevens was paid to leave the prosecution team. Professor Chait was actually able to access many of his internal private and secret notes that he was taking during the time, and he still believed, even at the very end, that Ray Buckey had indeed been involved in some kind of wrongdoing there, but once he left the team, it is very much suspected that a lot of his notes were taken with him. The prosecution's notes and information went with him, and then through the man's ended up being leaked over to the defense. So basically, this was giving away the entire case. I mean, it already had a number of problems, and then once you have a junior member of the team leave, as he did, then it's just a complete disaster. I mean, I couldn't imagine being part of something like this. It's a complete mess. January 1986, testimony in the over 2-year-long preliminary hearing comes to an end. January 17, 1986, District Attorney drops charges against 5 of the 7 indicted defendants. Ray Buckey and Peggy Buckey are prosecuted on 79 counts and 20 counts, respectively, of child sexual abuse. Now, it's very interesting here, too, that they leave out that there was a change in district attorneys. There was actually an election cycle that was going on earlier, and that thing had a huge impact on the case. There was very little oversight of some of the investigative process that was going on, the information gathering aspects. And that's another problem with the overall prosecution of the case, is that you have a change in leadership, which was actually very critical to the outcome. December 1986, Judy Johnson dies of alcohol poisoning before having a chance to testify at the trial. Now, it says alcohol poisoning here. In others, I've seen that it was a fatty liver, which was supposedly brought on by alcohol abuse, which would have been a fairly slow process from the beginning, taking, 2 or 3 years or whatever to wear her down. Because you have to remember, the initial discovery of this was back in 1983, so she had quite a long period of time that the alcohol use could have gotten worse, because many people said that back in 1983 that she would not even touch alcohol at parties or anything like that. She would drink water instead, or a spritzer or something like that. She would totally avoid alcohol. January 1987, Chief Prosecutor Rubin and her assistants are revealed to have withheld potentially exculpatory evidence from the defense. The evidence in question concerned the mental illness of Judy Johnson, the parent who first made accusations of sexual abuse against Buckey. Once again here, this is trying to push forward the implication that she had had some sort of a mental illness from the very beginning. No one actually knows whether or not that is the case. July 14, 1987, opening statements in the first McMartin Pre-school Trial begin. August 1987, the first victim, a girl now of age 12, takes the stand as a witness for the prosecution. And here, too, I think that you need to understand how critical these phases are. The defense team viciously went after all of the children who were actually put on the stand. Now, they said that the child victim witness list went all the way up to 40. It was actually 41. But by the time it came down to trial, after this period, it dropped down to 14 just for the preliminary hearings. The trial itself, they only had about 11. And even Glenn Stevens himself, who left the prosecution team and switched over essentially to an asset for the defense, said that what the defense team did to these children on the stand was unconscionable. December 1988, Ray Buckey's bail is reduced to $1.5 million. I don't know why they say reduced here, because before they said there was no bail set whatsoever. February 1989, Ray Buckey is released on bail after spending 5 years in jail. May 1989, Peggy Buckey takes the stand in her own defense. July 28, 1989, Ray Buckey takes the stand in his defense. January 18, 1990, the jury returns its verdict in the first McMartin trial. Peggy Buckey is acquitted on all counts. The jury is hung with respect to the Ray Buckey verdict on 13 of the 52 counts against him. 7 of the 12 jurors vote to acquit Ray on all counts. Now, it's really important to note here, too, that when you have a hung jury or you have mistrials or whatever else, that doesn't actually mean that the jurors think that the person is completely innocent. 7 of the jurors came out to the media afterward, and they said that they believed that Ray Buckey was indeed guilty, but that the case was simply too big and too complex to say beyond a reasonable doubt that he had done all of the things of which he was accused. So there was a huge problem with the way that the prosecution handled this. Had they handled it differently, They possibly could have gotten agreement from all 12 jurors. Late January of 1990, responding to pressure from parents, District Attorney Reiner announces that he will retry Ray Buckey on 8 counts involving 3 girls. So you see how the original list of more than 40 has now dropped all the way down to 3, and that's because many of the parents simply were not willing to put their children through all of this mess anymore. The kids were scared to death to face a person who they had accused, or at least, seemed to believe had done something to them, as most any child would be afraid. They were not going to be allowed to testify from another location, which is one of the things that the parents tried to fight for, so that they could use CCTV or closed-circuit television and go into the judge's chambers and then do their testimony from there, because it would have been easier on them. July 27, 1990, verdict is reached in the second McMartin trial. The jury is hung on all counts, but favors acquittal by a large margin. DA Ira Reiner decides not to ask for a third trial of Ray Buckey. The first 2 prosecutions have consumed some $15 million and 7 years of court time. 1991, the McMartin Pre-school is demolished. 1995, Virginia McMartin dies at the age of 88. HBO shows a docudrama, The Indictment, that's the one with James Woods, based on the McMartin case. As you can tell, there are a number of problems with the chronology just from my off-the-cuff commentary. That's the first time that I've ever looked through that thing. But if you want to know what really happened, get Ross Cheit's book, The Witch Hunt Narrative, Politics, Psychology, and the Sexual Abuse of Children. It's over 500 pages long, put out by Oxford University Press. It is an outstanding book. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.